Yeah, so howdy. My name is Ben, and the long and short of what I do is I stream, I tweet, and I blog about accessibility, core web technologies, and sometimes Eleventy. You can find me at these places. I tweet at Ben D. Myers, and my weekly Twitch stream about accessibility and core web tech, where I bring on friends from around the web dev industry. Is on Twitch at Some Antics Dev, and I blog at benmyers.dev. So one of the reasons I'm here actually is because a while back I wrote a blog post called "I Finally Understand the Lebanese Data Cascade." This talk is actually basically just a talk version of that blog post. So I think if Thomas or Steph, if either of you could put a link to that in the chat, I would super appreciate that. But yeah, I had been tinkering around with Eleventy for a while, but personally, it took me a while to build up a mental model of Eleventy's data cascade. And then once it really clicked for me, I felt so much more powerful and capable with Eleventy. I wanted to share my mental model as best as possible with you all today as well. And so that's what today is about. We'll start quickly with a quick definition, a few definitions rather. Data I would define as like variables you can use in your templates and layouts using templating syntax. We can go through a quick hello world. I'm sure lots of y'all have done this exercise. We start with some sort of template. Here I'm envisioning that I've built a documentation site for a plugin, an Eleventy plugin that I'm calling Eleventy plugin do the thing. And so we start with a simple markdown. And then, we add some data. We add some front matter data, maybe a title here, and we start using that. And at this point, you're like, I was maybe questioning like, well, why do this? Like, why have data kind of abstracted up in this front matter layer instead of having it down below? And so the next step in the little hello world experiment is actually that we remove using that templating in this, and we instead apply a layout to our template here. And then in our layout, we can go ahead and use that data. And suddenly, my mind is blown because all of a sudden I define data in one place, it's being used in other places. And so my mind is brimming with like, well, where else can I define data? And how does this data relate? When do I have what data when? And so that is what I'm here to talk to you about today, is actually this little bit of code from inside Eleventy. This is really the culmination of Eleventy's data cascade. Eleventy, when it builds each and every one of your templates, it aggregates data from a bunch of different sources and it combines them into one object, and it's a deep merge right here like we see. And so we can actually see the different sources that are coming in. Today I'm going to talk to you about those different sources and when you might use one source over another and how these things overwrite each other. But it all kind of culminates here in one object being created for each template that represents the data that you have available within that template's templating syntax. Um, so this process is the data cascade, Eleventy's order of operations for defining data and resolving conflicts. Now, a big part of your mental model for understanding the data cascade is a principle called co-location. Broadly speaking, this is the closer you are to a more specific template, or the more specifically you're applying your data to a template, the higher precedence that data is going to have over other data. So data that you've defined site-wide will get overridden by data that's defined for one particular template or page. So keep this in mind as we go through the data cascade. You'll notice that we're going to start very general, we're going to start very global, and we're going to work our way inwards. We're going to really journey to the center of the data cascade here. And the closer we get to a more specific template, the stronger this data will apply, the more it will win out over. Yeah, so we're going to start with step one. And just to call out, by the way, I am going to be going through this process because 1.0 is still in beta. I'm going to go through this process as it currently exists in 0.12. And then at the end, I'm going to cover a few quick changes to the Cascade that will take effect in 1.0. But because 1.0 is still beta, I'm not quite considering it totally canon quite yet. So just to give you a sense of kind of the flow, we're going to go from step to step. We're going to talk about how data overwrites other data. We're going to go from broadest to most specific. And along the way, I'm going to talk about the different use cases for each step of the cascade. And step one is global data files. To define a global data file, we first need to create a global data directory. By default, this exists in our input directory. It's got the name _data. So if we define a folder called _data, that will be our global data directory. And any file in there will be a global data file. So you can see here, I've got a global data file called foo.json. What you name these files is incredibly important because this is going to be the name of the data property that, like, as you would use it in your templates. So here, because we've called our global data file foo.json, anything that's defined inside foo.json will be made available in our templates as the foo data. So yeah, let's take a look at how we might do some stuff with that. For instance, one thing that people like to do is define a few site-wide constants, things like the general site name or the site URL. And so here I've got a global data file called site.json, and I define a couple of constants in here, like the site name and the site URL. And in my templating, I could access that with site.name as though it were a JavaScript. But we can do fancier things. Here we've got a JSON file, but your global data files can be JavaScript as well, and you can do a lot of really fun stuff with that. Here is, oh, wow. There we go. Here's an example of using a JavaScript global data file to define, to expose some of our environment variables to our templates. So here we've defined the database URL and Eleventy env environment variables to our templates. Those will be available. So if you wanted to do something like check, like, am I building for development mode right now, or am I building for production? You could do that using something like this. And so this is an example of how we might use some JavaScript here to define some global data. We can start to do some even fancier stuff. Like maybe we need to make an API call. Maybe, because in this case, I'm building a docs site for a hypothetical NPM package, maybe I would be interested in showing off how many people have starred my repository on GitHub. I can make a fetch. And so I've defined this stargazers.js global data file, and it exports a function. That function returns a promise, which is me fetching the stargazers from GitHub. And so Eleventy will wait until that promise resolves, and it'll return whatever is returned from this promise when it resolves. And so now I have this stargazers array data property that I could use throughout my code, which is extremely cool. And I think you can even do some even sillier things. I had a use case on a community calendar project I was building for a Discord server I'm in, where we were using the all contributors bot on GitHub to thank people for their contributions to the repo. If you've never seen it, it's a lovely tool. It's great to thank people for a wide variety of possible contributions. And it defines an all contributors RC file in the root level of your repo. I wanted to be able to thank people on our site, though, so I needed to pull in that data from the all contributors RC file. And so here I am doing some file system operations. I'm reading that file, which existed outside of any of Eleventy's scope. I'm reading it, I'm parsing it as JSON, and then I'm exposing the results as a contributors array, which, because this is the contributors.js global data file, this is exposed in my templates as the contributors data value. So you can do a lot of really cool stuff with this. You have the full access to the node ecosystem within here. So there's just an incredible amount of potential for global data. So what kinds of things might we use it for? Oh yeah, here's a few examples of me using this data. It's worth noting that global data is evaluated once at the start of the build, so it's not going to make a bunch of API calls, like make the same API call for every template. It's evaluated once, which makes it really, really ideal for API calls. In general, I would use global data for things like site-wide concerns, like when we saw the site constants. You could use it for your API fetches, your file system, stuff like that. Stuff that you only really need to do once. Even if you only end up using it on one page, I tend to think anytime you're interacting with any sort of API, it just makes sense to do it on global data. No sense making it more specific. Global data just makes a lot of sense to me. So that's where I would use something like global data. Step 2 in the data cascade is the directory data files. So because this is the next step in the data cascade, any data that you define in directory data will override data in the global data. So if you have two properties with the same name, directory data files will win out. So here I've got a directory called docs, and inside docs, I've got a few templates that are markdown templates, and I would like to create some directory data. A use case for this is, you'll notice I'm defining some front matter up top. I've got a layout property, I've got an author property, those things to me feel like they would end up being very repetitive. Most docs pages should probably have the same layout. If you're thinking of this as like a blog instead, most blog posts, unless you're doing some serious art direction, are probably going to have a fairly standard layout. And also, if this is my package, I'm likely to be the one writing most of the docs. So I would say that, putting my name as the author is a very sensible default. These are things that could get really repetitive. I would have to define this across all of my different templates. Not very ideal. So instead, you can create a global data directory. These are the possible names for the global data directory file that you could use. So you'll notice that is a JSON or JavaScript file whose name corresponds to the directory that it's in. So I have a folder called docs, a file called docs.json. And so these things have to match. You have to call your directory data file, the name of the directory, then .json, .11tydata.json, or .11tydata.js. And so here I'm providing some sensible defaults that will apply consistently throughout all the files, all the templates inside this docs directory. So this is really good for preventing repetition and making sure that similar content is treated uniformly. I tend to structure my projects so that similar content ends up in the same directory. All of my blog posts end up in a blog directory, and all of my talk and other events end up in another directory. So this lets me treat similar content uniformly, just really, really simply, I think. Worth noting that if you have subdirectories, directory data cascades down. So directory data at the top level will cascade down to subdirectories, but you can also define directory data in your subdirectories, and that will win out over the parents. So again, the more specific you get, the more likely you are to win out in the data cascade. So that is directory data files. Up next, we've got template data files. So you've got your template, you can define a separate file adjacent to it with a similar name, and you can define data in there. So here, I've got my awesome feature.markdown template. And next to it, I'm defining awesomefeature.11tdata.json. And in here, I'm providing an override for one specific field. So even though I specified that author had a directory data type of Ben Myers, so templates by default in that directory would get that Ben Myers author, here I'm specifically saying, no. Awesome feature will specifically have the author of Zach Leatherman. So it overrides that for that specific template. Here we're getting much more specific because you can only define a template data file for exactly one, right? So co-location, again, is our friend, and we're providing some more specific data here. However, my verdict on this is I don't tend to use it a whole lot because I have the capacity to include most of that same information in the template front matter, and that tends to work better for how I organize things. If you have uses for template data files, I would be super interested to hear them. Please feel free to reach out. One of the things I'm really excited about with Eleventy serverless, actually, is I have found that template data files, as separate from the front matter, are really helpful, specifically combining serverless template data files and computed data, which is a thing we'll get to later. That I found has been a combination that has worked well for me. If you're interested in learning more, see my talk that I gave at the Eleventies. Henri, if you could put that link in the chat, that would be excellent. Speaking of, I should probably make sure I have the chat. All right. Cool. So step 4 in the data cascade is layout front matter. And you'll notice I have this little asterisk here because this is actually moving in 1.0. So here, I've defined up at the top of this file, this is my layout, my page.html layout. I've defined a social image data property in my front matter, and I've set it to a default value. I've got some default that I expect people to use, probably anticipating that most pages will actually end up overriding this, but it's better to have something rather than nothing. I'm consuming it here on line 11. I'm providing my social image link in this meta tag. And you'll notice something weird here, which is specifically that this actually kind of defies our principle of co-location. This is just due to an initial implementation of layout front matter that was different from how the docs explained it. And so the docs were actually updated to go hey, this actually is going to break your mental model a bit. This is weird. Yes, we understand layouts can apply to multiple templates, and so anything that you're doing in layout is less specific than anything you're doing to a template. That said, the data cascade as it exists in 0.12 will prize layout front matter over template data files even in the data cascade. So it is a weird thing. It's moving in 1.0. It had to wait until 1.0 because that's such a breaking change. But yeah, this is the one time where co-location actually doesn't really see us through in our... And so when would you use this? Well, this is applied to all templates that use that layout, and I would consider it sensible defaults meant to be overridden. As in, almost certainly you wouldn't ever actually end up with a template that really has that default social image, for instance. You would expect that most templates would but this is the sensible default that you can use as a fallback. And as far as I can tell, I think it's really, really great for things like meta tags, stuff like that. That's less your content, but more just about the general like meta aspects of your page, for instance. But I don't really tend to use layout front matter a whole lot. So if you've got other use cases, again, please do feel free to reach out. There we go. Sorry, just making sure I was all caught up with the chat. Up next, we have template front matter. I love this. I use it a lot. Might even abuse it. But you can define data at the top of your... I almost feel like this is kind of unremarkable to talk about because this is, I think, such an integral part to working with Eleventy that I would guess that many of us are very familiar with it. But it is worth calling out that data that we've defined here is far more specific than any of the other data we've talked about so far. So this will beat out over the layout front matter, the template data file, the global data, directory data. This will win. So you can see that I'm specifically providing an author here. In this case, it's Zach Leatherman, and I'm specifically providing a social image. So even though I've set up those sensible defaults, I'm overriding them for this specific page. And of course, Zach is responsible for the awesome feature. He always is. Cool. So I love this because it's got like maximum co-location, like my template and its data are right next to each other in one file, you know, just super easy to like scroll up and see like, hey, what metadata do I have? What front matter do I have for this specific template? And so, yeah, this is, I would heartily like 100% recommend using this for your like utmost page specific. Step 6 is going to get a little weird. It's computed data. Computed data is data derived from other data. And what makes computed data weird is that you actually define it in any other stage of the data cascade. And it will apply to the same number of templates that other data in that point of the data cascade would apply to. So here's a quick example. Here, I've got an events directory. This wouldn't make sense so much for our like little plugin documentation site, but this is an example I've used for that community calendar project. I've got an events.eleventydata.js directory data file. This applies to all the templates inside my events directory. And you'll notice I've got this property in here called Eleventy computed. Whenever you call a data property Eleventy computed, Eleventy actually sets it aside and waits until the very end of the cascade to start evaluating it. So inside my Eleventy computed, I specify that I've got a property called Google Calendar link. And this is a function that takes in the various data defined for a specific event, and it creates a Google Calendar link that I could handily include with the Google Calendar link data property in my templates. This will be, even though this is set up as directory data, Eleventy computed data, it will evaluate for every template. So every template will get its own computed Google Calendar link based on these properties. I think this is an incredibly powerful tool. I know many people often turn to like filters and shortcodes to transform data from like its like data shape into some handily formatted, but I personally prefer to kind of do it with computed data. That way I just have some nice clean variables I can use in my code. So that is computed data. Computed data sort of follows its own data cascade. So if you define computed data in a global data file, that will lose out to computed data defined in a directory data file and so forth. So it's kind of got its own mini cascade going on there. Yeah, I think it's powerful and it's convenient to be able to have like your own like transformed variables, but I also think it can be a little more tricky to debug because computed data by its nature can be scattered throughout your code base. You can define computed data at several points. It can be hard sometimes to tell like where specifically is this data coming from. Like I don't always necessarily check the computed data straight away. So that is the data cascade as it exists in 0.12. We started our global data, we go to directory data, we go to template data files, then we kind of veer off a bit to layout front matter, we come back to our template front matter, and then there's computed data, and computed data will always win out over the other properties. So we should talk about what's changed in 1.0 though. In 1.0, we've got our global data as normal. There's this new config global data that we'll talk about briefly. Then we have our directory data. And then layout front matter actually moves to be between directory data and template data files. And so this means that co-location wins again. Co-location, we can define our data at the layout level, and templates can override it with ease. The more specific we get, the more our data wins. Love it. It's great. So this is the new order of the data cascade as it exists in 1.0. Now, some of you might have looked at the Eleventy docs and you might be going, hey, Ben, you're actually wrong about this. Config global data is at the top. And that is how the docs say it is. So config global data, according to the docs, should be in spot number 1. So it should be weaker precedence than the global data. However, as it actually exists in the Eleventy source code, config global data is currently being evaluated after the global data. There is a pull request that someone has opened up to make it so that config global data actually does get evaluated before the global data. But currently, in the latest Eleventy beta for 1.0, this is the order, is config global data technically has a higher precedence than global data. And so here's how you could use this. I'm in my Eleventy.js file, and I'm calling Eleventy config.add global data. I give it the name of the property that I want to use. So in this case, site URL. And then I give it a value that I want that to be. You could also do all the same stuff you can do in your global data files. Like you could have a function, and that function can even return a promise. And Eleventy will handle that just fine for you. This isn't so much meant for us as site developers, but rather it's mostly intended as a feature for plugins. Specifically, a way for plugins to start injecting data into the Cascade. This, I think, will be incredibly powerful for content management systems who can get, your content from the CMS into your Eleventy site just by calling this function. So that's mostly what this is for. This is handy so that you don't have to go through the whole underscore data thing. I think it's quick and easy, but we're not really, as site developers, we're not really the intended audience for this. Nevertheless, I'm incredibly excited for it. I see Brian's excited for it as well. Super, super stoked for this. So that is config global data.